Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, What Does Leadership Look Like Around Here? Hosted by HRDQU and presented by David Horth and Chuck Palus. My name is Sarah and I'll moderate the webinar today. The webinar is going to be about an hour, and if you have any questions, you can type them into that chat box. We'll be getting to these questions at the end of the presentation or in an email if we do run out of time. Welcome, David and Chuck.
Thank you so much for this opportunity, Sarah. Looking forward to being with everybody, and hope that you get some insights and for your own practices with the tools that Chuck and I have helped develop. Chuck?
Hello, everybody. Nice to be here again. Not the first time we've done work with Sarah and company, so we're pleased to be back.
So we're going to dive right in and get you experiencing the use of metaphor for helping people with developing leadership. So let me just do my little click here. So what we're going to do is we're going to be showing you some images, and we want you to pick an image. Each of these images has got a number beside it. And we want you to pick one of those images, and then what stands out for you in the image, and any connections you make with yourself as a leader. And we wanted you to type those, so you type the number of the image you selected, a little bit about what stands out for you, and then the connections you make as a leader. And we want you to type that into the chat box. So I'm going to show you a set of images right off the top, and there's, as you see, 9 of them. But we're going to show you them in a lot richer versions of those to look at as you go through. But you may have some ideas already about which of those images is going to stand out for you. As I say, type into the chat box what image you've chosen, which number, what stands out for you a little bit, and then how it describes you as a leader. So here's the first of those images, and I'll just hold that for a few seconds. I see people typing some lovely answers already. One of our favorite images, this one. I guess this is apropos.
Just choose one image. That's the one that captures your imagination about you at your best as a leader.
Nice one for the Olympics here. And we'll show you the block of all the images together at the end as well. Hot air balloons at sunset. And then the final image, and then I'll show you all 9 images again. So the number of the image you chose, something that stands out for you in the image, and how it describes you as a leader. 7 seems to be quite a popular one, I notice. Working together, training other people, developing other people. Yeah, someone really likes the Fruit Loops. We like them too.
I think that's
metaphorically,
your favorite,
metaphorically and for breakfast. It's lovely. This leadership as being alongside somebody. Somebody put that for image 1. And 7 seems to be a really popular image. And there's Sarah's written something about different colors and flavors being part of a greater whole. Very nice. Navigating through rough seas, that would be presumably the one that's associated with the white water. Boy, is 7 popular. It's how to help my staff through new aspects of their jobs. 7 again, coaching and guiding, says Maria. Because it says, I always be the leader of the group, and that's number 4, which is the creatures. I keep forgetting what they're called. Number 7 has to be the most popular one today. Somebody sees themselves as a budding leader. We're always learning. Meerkats, thank you. So meerkats in number 4. Thanks, Sarah. Let's move on. You've got some great thoughts about it, and you're already tapping into this notion of using metaphor, very rich metaphors. And that was what we were asking you to do, the task of showing the image. And Chuck, would you just take this on?
Yeah, thank you, David. So we're here today to talk about the power of metaphor in the work we do, developing leaders and working organizations. David and I have done some research in this area, and we were looking for the competencies and capabilities that come from the realm of artists. And that's a popular topic today. When we first started looking at it, people were saying, what are the connections between artistry and leadership? And we were able to zero in on this idea that good artists and good leaders both use metaphors. And when we started talking about this, people would say, well, what do you mean metaphors? That's what I learned in 5th grade, right? That's a part of speech. How could a part of speech be a leadership capability? And so we have to remind people that metaphors are not just what you learn in English class. They're really a fundamental way that we think. A metaphor is simply when one thing is like another thing and you're making a comparison. And you can argue whether that's an analogy or a metaphor. The broader category is metaphor. And we use it all the time when we think. It's especially useful in exploring new or complex ideas when you're just sort of new into a territory and you're trying to figure things out. Then it's helpful to have metaphors to help you think in different ways. There's some really good books on this topic. We'll refer you to if you're interested in this. The classic is the Lakoff and Johnson Metaphors We Live By. And they do some really fundamental research that shows that, indeed, metaphors are intrinsic to our thought. And Hofstadter takes it even further, that analogy is really all there is to thinking. We're always comparing one thing to another. That's what thinking is. And so examples of metaphors, they're with us all over the place all the time. When we talk about life as a journey, time is a river, love is war, love is a journey, love is a rose, and so on. And then, of course, you get into organizational metaphors. And so today we're talking about leadership metaphors. And so we can talk about leaders as pilots, leaders are generals, leaders are parents, and then, of course, leadership is a journey. And so we realized that one thing that can be a difficulty in leadership development is that people don't have enough metaphors for leadership. We don't teach leadership or develop leadership in a way that's metaphor-rich often. And so we really wanted people to have better, richer conversations. And so we started developing these tools. And you just use the first tool, Visual Explorer, and those are photos chosen for their metaphoric resonance with everyday life and with work in organizations in particular. So leadership metaphors, there's such variety I mentioned. And when we started talking about leadership as direction, alignment, and commitment, the DAC framework, which David will introduce more formally in a moment, we realized that anything that produces direction, alignment, and commitment might be leadership. And so it made us realize that maybe we're not looking broadly enough for our inspirations for leadership. So we started digging a little bit more deeply. We realized, first of all, that there's the singular and the plural. There's metaphors for leaders as individuals, but then there's also metaphors for leadership as something that's collective. So in the first example, leaders as individuals, the metaphors range from the coach, the guide, and a little more flamboyant, the tyrant, king and queen. But then the more collective ones have to do with, flocks and squadrons and gangs and teams and all those kinds of things. So hence we thought since we wanted to really focus the conversation on leadership in particular, we realized Visual Explorer was a great tool, maybe a little broad for the leadership conversation in particular. So we developed this tool called Leadership Metaphor Explorer, and that's what we will take you through in a moment. And we use that in particular to talk about what are you like as leadership, and what is leadership like around here?
So one of the things that when Chuck and I were doing some research on contemporary leadership at that time, it was in the early 2000s, we use as a way of thinking about leadership, a working, if you will, a working way of thinking about leadership as making shared sense of complexity. And we showed some kind of vehicle in turbulence representing that complexity, where it's not necessarily one person who's the leader, but we're all involved in this process of making sense of things and moving forward in some ways. So one of the things that comes out of this is work led by Cindy McCauley, and if you're interested in looking up Cindy McCauley, there's a small book that she's recently published called Direction, Alignment, and Commitment. And we were looking at leadership. If leadership is a process, and it's a process that works within the system, what does it look like? Well, if it's a process, it has to have outcomes. And those outcomes are defined as, that we've reached agreement in the group or a collective on the direction we're headed. Alignment is about, that we've actually figured out who's doing what, the roles are well coordinated. And then finally, where we feel committed to the group, we feel committed to each other, we'll go the extra mile for each other in order to actually do this work together effectively. So there's a lot more depth we can go into this way of thinking about leadership as a process within a system. And this is some of the work that Chuck and myself have been involved in, working under the leadership of Cindy McCauley and her research around thinking about leadership in new ways. So one of the things we'd like you to do is we'd like you to actually use this tool, which looks at this, in your organizational community. When you're doing your best work, how are these things of shared direction, alignment, commitment created? How does that happen? And so we want you to choose a card that describes what that's like, and I'm going to show you a set of them, and then I'm going to show you them individually, probably a little quicker through these because
David?
We've yes.
Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt you, David. Could I just suggest that you ponder this question just a moment? We apologize. We go a little quickly through the exercise, and it's a little awkward doing it online. Typically, we do this face-to-face, but when it works at its best face-to-face, we slow down this reflective dialogue process. And so if you can just maybe make a couple notes about this question in your organization or community. When are you doing your best work together? When you are doing your best work together, how are shared direction, alignment, and commitment created? So really think about that. Using the metaphoric again, what's it like?
So great. So you're going to put in the chat box. Again, there'll be a number. It will actually be a letter rather than a number. You'll see a letter that's on each card. We'll show a block of them, and then we'll get you to say which ones make sense to you and what connections do you make about this question. How a shared direction, alignment, commitment created.
We have a question about where's the chat box, and I believe we're answering in the questions box. Is that right, Sarah?
It's it's actually called. Yeah.
It's the chat box. They'll be typing into the chat box.
Okay, so
Vicky's asking where to go to open the chat box. That was what she was asking about.
Yeah, Vicky's actually typing in right now to the chat box.
I see. Okay. Thanks, Vicky. Thanks, Sarah.
You're in the chat box. Okay, great.
So here's the block of these from letter I to letter Q, a set of 9 metaphors. And we said we've tailored these very specifically to leadership. They may not have the richness of the images you saw previously, but they're very much tailored towards metaphors that we've gathered for thinking about leadership. So I'll go through these fairly quickly. Community of practice, that was letter I. Letter J, confluence of agendas.
In the full set, there's how many in the full set now, David? 84 of these different metaphors.
Yep.
So we're just showing you a subset for this exercise.
K with a network of peers. These were created, you see at the bottom here, they're created by our good friend Bruce Fly. He's also a graphic facilitator. L, visionary landscapes. There's some great responses coming up. Sometimes these might feel a little negative in some ways, and that was very deliberate. High performance engines is N, Le Tour de France. By the book commanders. Resigned prisoners, one of our favorite images, not necessarily our favorite response, but we really like this image. Some of us feel like that. Conflict smoothers, are we a group of conflict smoothers? Is that how we create direction, shared direction, alignment, commitment? And then there's the whole block again. I see some people can't separate their choices. That's fine. And Mac, if you can just write a few comments about your choices. About that seems to be the way we create the shared direction, alignment, commitment in our part of the organization or in our organization. I work better when we feel that we're all peers. That was K, right? Yeah. Network of peers, yes, indeed.
And as David mentioned, that some of these have negative connotations, and that's on purpose. And so we want to help people have conversations about difficult things, to have the difficult conversation. And one of the things we realized is that metaphors help that, because instead of saying something is something, which can sound very direct and very aggressive sometimes, black and white, if you say something is like something, then that's a little bit more of an inviting way to say it, because you're really inviting somebody else to say, well, it's like something a little different, or I agree, it's like this in some ways but not in others. And then, of course, the drawings in particular kind of invite conversation. Even say the -1 of the resigned prisoner. There's a story there, and you notice the door is actually open, and so people can really make a lot of sense out of these in ways that are hard without the metaphors in your hand.
I noticed that some people say, well, in some parts of my role, it's like this, or in some parts of the organization, it's like this, and other parts, yes. There are different leadership cultures, if you will, in different parts of the organization, maybe associated with the function of the organization and so on. And one of the things you'll hear us talking about is that it was like that once upon a time, now it's like this, and we'd like it to be like this. And that's part of the conversation that we can talk about when we think about leadership as a journey. So I'm going to just move us on. There's some great responses, Chuck, on these. Sarah so I'm just going to move us on, and you can take this over from here, Chuck.
Okay, thank you, David. So the question, what behaviors and beliefs will help drive the business strategy? That's a very business-oriented question, and so in our work and probably in your work, you're being asked to be more strategic in the way you develop leaders and leadership. And so we've really made a point of looking at the relation between strategy and leadership. And in particular, we're really interested in leadership, something we call leadership culture. That might be a new word for you. And leadership culture is, there's a simple definition. It's really the set of shared beliefs and behaviors that create direction, alignment, and commitments for the organization. And so it turns out different cultures have different assumptions and different beliefs and behave differently in how they create direction, alignment, and commitment. As I was saying previously, there's a lot of choices we have for how we do that. There's not just one right way. And so cultures exemplify that. Leadership is different in different cultures, and yet it's very hard to talk about. And then it's also tricky to align that with strategy. But through the metaphors, we've found that we can make the leadership culture more visible to people. And when it's more visible, that is, the behaviors and beliefs are more visible, then we can say, hey, do those line up with our strategy? What kind of beliefs and behaviors will we need to drive our strategy, if not the ones we have now, or maybe a version of what we have now? And so it turns out that's a very healthy conversation, and that's where I'm going to take us right now. So leadership culture, there's that word again, and there's another new phrase for you, shared action logics. Action logics are really the beliefs and behaviors driving leadership of the organization. It's, the beliefs is the logic part, the behaviors is the action part, so I'm really saying the same thing. And so in our work, we found that there's really three modes of leadership culture: dependence, independence, and interdependence. And dependent leadership cultures are those in which people, the shared beliefs are that people in authority and power are responsible for leadership. It's a very individualistic mode. In the independent mode of leadership culture, it's believed that leadership emerges out of individual knowledge, expertise, and ambition. It's people behaving independently and yet powerfully. And then the third is where leadership is understood as a collective activity, all right? And a lot of our clients and colleagues in organizations, we know this from experience, tend to be trying to move up this dimension. In other words, people think that they have enough dependent leadership. That's usually not the problem. And the question is, how can we get more beliefs and behaviors around people being independent? And then the holy grail for a lot of organizations now is how to become more interdependent, in which leadership is viewed as a collective activity. Again, hard to talk about unless you have some tools. And so here you see the way the tool, the Leadership Metaphor Explorer, fits in with this model. And in fact, Leadership Metaphor Explorer is key to this model. If you look at the label on these three cards, they're in red. And so that's keyed to the red dependent model. And so these are more dependent ways of understanding leadership. And some of you might have chosen these. These were choices we just showed you. Likewise, independence. Here we have positive images, like a visionary landscaper or a high-performance engine, but then also independence can lead to lack of coordination, lack of alignment. And so it's not all rosy. Like, none of these are perfect in themselves. They all have their ups and downs. And then finally, interdependence is when we start talking about communities of practice, confluence of agenda, network of peers, and notice those labels are in blue. The independent is in green. So that's actually a little code we've placed in here. You don't have to reveal that to participants, but it's kind of a good way to say, okay, looking at all of the metaphors that people are choosing and talking about, where are we headed? Where are we now and where are we headed? And that's often the key question. Where are we now? And to achieve our strategy as an organization, where do we need to be? So there's always a kind of a gap analysis involved. And so here's a diagram of that. There's the three-part culture model. And so a lot of our work is helping people to see where they are now and talk about their business strategy. And that shows where we need to be. So if you look on the right there under business strategies, if your strategy is really to be local and routine and regimented, you might need a dependent leadership culture. It's not a bad thing. Dependent leadership cultures do a lot of things, and your strategy might call for that. On the other hand, if your strategy is about being multi-regional, you're trying to get into new places in the world, there's a lot of heroic and entrepreneurial energy involved, you might need a leadership culture that's more independent. And then finally, a lot of organizations are trying to be much more global, adaptive, and sustainable. And what we found out is that an interdependent leadership culture is necessary. What happens is, as I think Peter Drucker said, strategy, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And so whatever your culture is, it's going to dominate the strategy. So if your strategy is to become more global, adaptable, and sustainable, but you have a dependent leadership culture, watch out. And so here's how we worked with one client. I think I could say their name is Microsoft. I don't know if there's any Microsoft folks out there, but the other identifying details have been removed, so it's okay. But it really was the instructions we offered people. So let's talk about our relationships now and the way we need our relationships for the future to meet our strategy. And so we asked groups working in small groups to come up with one card per cell. So they had a lot of relationships, actually. It was their one group working across clusters, and then they had a partner A and a partner B. And so they analyzed each of those in particular, what kind of relationships they needed. So it turns out they needed a different aspect of their culture, or they needed to come up with a kind of a new aspect of their culture for each of their partners. And so then the results look something like this, where you can see they've pasted the cards into cells with some words describing this. And so this kind of activity is very useful. These flip charts now are not just words, but they're words and images, which is also typical of metaphors. Words plus images help people to think. And so they were able to create these artifacts and then actually keep them up during the strategy section of their retreat. So this was a useful device. Another example, now and future. And the picture to the left is kind of telling. You see people with the cards all laid out between them, and they're leaning in and looking. And so that looking and leaning in and, working with the cards as much as they are eye to eye, that is helpful for dialogue because we like to say it puts something in the middle of the conversation. One of the problems with having a good conversation or a good dialogue is that, there's nothing there except our words, and words can fail us. Whereas if you have something in the middle that you can touch and handle and point to, then, even if English is not your first language maybe, an image can help you convey your point. And here's an example from our colleague Bruce Fly, who's actually the artist who worked on these cards with us. He's a graphic facilitator. And so graphic facilitation is something you might have used. It's where a person, an artist, works up a big white space and captures the meaning of the dialogue in the room with drawings. And in this case, Bruce is using some digital tools and produced this artifact for the group he was working with. And you can see how he combined both Visual Explorer images and the culture model, as well as the metaphors that they chose. So here he's working with this group so they can sort of map their future progress. Here's a little bit of a lower tech example. And you can see the cards laid out on the table. So the one way we know that this is maybe a little bit different is you notice the combat here in the corner of the room. This picture was actually taken in the Green Zone in Baghdad a few years ago, and a team from CCL was facilitating high-level conversations between the Department of State and the Department of Defense. And they were really working in two silos to a large degree. There needed to be some handoffs because of the change in command, and so they really needed to get aligned. Is really what they were doing in this retreat, and they used the metaphor cards. People sometimes ask us, these cards, they're, we've not seen anything like these before. We're not sure if serious people will use these, and the answer has proven that serious people do use these. They actually appreciate them for all the reasons we're describing, because it helps them to have the conversation. So the answer to that question is always, if it helps the serious people, right, have a good conversation, a serious conversation, then they're thrilled with tools like this, and that's what we found to be true. Okay, we've used this all over the world. Here's an example. I think this classroom must be in Afghanistan, and English is not the first language here, but people, like I said, people get the metaphors, they get the images, and so it turns out that drawings plus words in a metaphoric format are good for people of all ages and multiple cultures. Here's a prototype in Thailand. Here's a Thai monk who's browsing the cards and getting ready to give us some feedback. And so, again, this is, I think, a visual explorer from Afghanistan. The links here are to our support sites, for the first one being Metaphor Explorer, the second one being Visual Explorer. So if you copy those links, they'll take you to the CCL blog space, and they'll give you more information on these. All right. David, do you want to add anything?
No, nothing really to add, Chuck. This is those blogs that you talk to, if people type those links in, it's one of the ways of keeping up with how people are using these tools, and we keep those regularly updated so people are learning from each other about how to use such tools.
All right, great. Thanks so much. Now we do actually have time for a Q&A, so attendees, go ahead, submit those into that chat box. And while we wait for some of those questions to filter in, for joining us today, we're actually offering 15% off the LME. So just go over to hrdqstore.com for any more information and to purchase. And then that coupon code is LM2016. All right, so let's get to our first question. I noticed that some of the images you showed have what feels like a negative connotation. Was this deliberate, and why?
Let me have first crack at this one, Chuck. Yeah, you'll notice that, and we called it out while we were presenting. And one of the things that we use this for is to get people to use this in terms of a journey that their team or their organization has been on. And so, one of the things that we'll ask people to do is say, what does leadership look like at its worst in your organization or in the past in some ways? And choose a card or cards for that. What does it look like now, and where would you like it to get to in terms of that leadership culture? And so often when we're using the cards like that, it talks often about the negative sides of a type of leadership, if you will. And so that's why we deliberately included some that. One of the ones that wasn't in the set here, for example, was that we gathered from all over the world. We asked people to talk about leadership at its best and its worst, and one of the cards in the deck says actually gathered in Australia was a pool of sharks when they were talking about what was clearly an independent kind of culture, that people were fighting for turf and so on. So that's why we have some of those negative images in there. It's talking about the reality of how things have been in the past, for example.
Open up difficult conversations. Sarah, one question people have noticed is that they're not seeing the definitions of the leadership cultures in there because that's a slide with builds. Is it possible afterwards for you to repost it, maybe with those definitions on a separate slide?
Well, actually, the correct slides are on GoToWebinar, so they can actually download it under just handouts.
Oh, right. But will it have the build? Because what's happening is the build covers up the definition.
Yeah, well, we can, when we send out the Q&A, we can also add the correct ones then, yep. All right?
Yeah, that's good. Yep.
All right, perfect. So let's get on to the next question, and that one is coming from Donna. Do you have suggestions for using this technique with virtual teams located around the world?
You want me to take that one, David?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so this is a little demo of that. We've led you through an exercise, 2 exercises actually, in which we've just used 9 cards from each of the decks. And so it shows that you can do the exercise with a limited number of the cards. And at first we weren't sure if that would work very well, because one of the things we really like actually about the cards is that there's lots of choices, and people can browse, and they have fun browsing. Online it's a little trickier. It's a little harder to browse online no matter what format you're in. And there's different ways around that. One is just, if 9's not enough, for example, you could use the method we had here. If you like more than 9, you can send around a PDF of more images, and then call them up when people discuss them. So we had just a chat box. We're not having live dialogue here because there's so many people. But if you had a team and you were doing some virtual work, then obviously you can open up the webinar to people's voices, and they can actually talk about the images. Sometimes people ask, how do you get the digital forms of these? And the simplest way to do it is to just use your camera and take a photograph of the card. We all have good cameras now at our disposal. And so we've found that that's actually the quickest way to accomplish getting the digital versions created.
Yeah, one of those virtual sessions we had, Chuck, we had people in Israel, Ireland. There was one other country and a couple of locations in the U.S. where we're doing something like this, and with various forms of the CCL preferred vendor for doing webinars is WebEx, and I'm pretty certain that GoTo has that as well, where you can actually separate people out into different virtual rooms, and then the facilitators can actually go around the room, so you get people working in small groups and doing things like sending ahead either PDF images of the cards, or in some cases what we've had people have, they've actually got the actual decks in their hands, and they're set at each location, and they're using them in that way, rather. So they're face to face in their own room, and then we do a kind of a virtual debrief as well. So there's multiple ways of doing it. I hope that helps with your question, Donna.
All right, great, thank you. Next question is coming from Michelle. What would your suggestions be for a new organization that is trying to define its leadership culture?
Great question. I'm going to let you have a go at that one, Chuck.
All right. Let's see, a new organization trying to define the leadership culture. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of rich work you can do beyond the cards. So I don't want us to sound like we only use the cards all the time. Let's see, so one technique we've been using a lot is what we call the from here to there model. And it just simply means you get people to look at their journeys from someplace to where you are now, and then there where you're heading towards, past, present, future, if you will. And even a new organization has a precedent of what people have experienced in the past. So it can be really helpful to say, where are we coming from? What's typical in our industry? What have we all experienced about leadership cultures? You could have a dialogue about that. You can use the cards. There's lots of ways for people to share their stories of where they're coming from. That's just good old storytelling. But having the cards is helpful. So you can pick some cards. You can talk about where we're coming from. So where are we now? Even if it's a new organization, there's some culture that's already brewing, and people can see that and sense that and talk about it. And when the organization is new is the best time. So if you can get that initial moment when things are still fresh and saying, what's really guiding our beliefs and behaviors about leadership? Again, put those on the table, talk about it in a journey sense, and then where are we trying to go? What's our strategy? And people love to do that because it's a sense of shared direction. And it might be the culture that's forming. It might be that people need to say, hey, look at our past. Let's not kid ourselves. We've all come from places which the culture was not ideal. We don't want that. Okay, what do you want? And whether you use the cards or some other technique, that kind of shared visioning is important. And it's just really cool when you get the whole journey laid out. We often get people off out of their chairs, up to the wall, using big pieces of butcher paper or whiteboards and tape, and markers, and just get them to map their desired journey. And you can, like I said, you can do it if you're a brand new organization. It's really cool to do that with organizations that are 20 or 30 years old and look at the past as well as the future.
One of the occasions,
yeah.
I was just going to say one occasion that I've actually deliberately used his cards was I had the opportunity to spend time with actually one-on-one with a senior leadership team, and so starting with the CEO, I just got him to, I said, I want you to choose. I actually had the deck of cards with me. I said, I want you to choose one that represents where this organization was, and one where it is now, and one where you'd like it to be in the future. And he ended up by picking 5, and so he needed a bit more granularity to it, because he wanted to be able to talk about what was it like a couple of generations ago, what it's like now, and then he wanted to talk about where he sees it happening over the next year or two. And then his final one was, I'm not going to be around when we get to this place. I'm probably retired before that, but I think the organization needs to get to this place. And one of the things that tends to happen, you'll notice it in some of the images we showed you, is that there tends to be, when people are asked to talk about leadership culture, there tends to be a move from dependent towards interdependent. And one of the things, of course, getting into the theory of that is there's a step that you can't avoid. You don't get from dependent to interdependent without going through independent. That's a phase, a developmental phase for individuals and organizations. That is just how it is. But that's one of the ways we've done it, is by working with individuals, the senior leadership teams, and not just using cards, but other ways of getting a conversation going. The other thing I wanted to point out was simple tools getting into action, at least at the first level of thinking about actions. What do we need to stop doing, start doing, or continue doing in order to be able to move from here to there, as Chuck would put it? What are the kind of things that we need to do in order to make that move to a new culture?
All right, great. Thank you. Let's see. Next question is coming from Michael. How many images are in the leadership metaphor kit? If we are working with a team in the same room, would more than one set of the cards be needed?
For 18 people, you'd probably just need one deck. I think there's 83 cards total of actual cards. There's some instruction cards as well. But you'd probably need for that, and if there's 18 people, one deck would probably do fine.
Okay. All right, next question coming from William. Do you think this program would be good for an RN leadership course?
RN for registered nurse? I think so.
Yes, correct.
We've actually used it in that sort of forum, haven't we, Joe? Not us directly, but our colleagues.
Healthcare. Yep. We work a lot in healthcare. So here's an example of serious people: registered nurses, hospitals, doctors. They all, of course, take their work very, very seriously, and yet those environments can be the most constrained. So the nursing environments, the hospital environments, there's just so much tradition there. There's so much, there's so much dependent leadership typically, because the doctors often have the upper hand. And so people are really, really interested in, what are our options? People want to know what their options are. They don't want to be told, okay, so here's a key distinction. In a lot of leadership programs, I dare say, people are told pretty much what the answer is. These are the capabilities of our organization. This is what leadership looks like. This is the way we have to do it. And, that's a tough sell for people. And it's really, in our view, not the way to develop leadership. If you're going to be more independent and more interdependent, first of all, you have to help people to think for themselves, not just be told what the model is. So if you're leaning towards independence and interdependence, it actually requires a different format for the way you're working with people in the room for leadership development. So this format, again, it's a little hard to tell online, but it's really about the dialogue. It's really about the face-to-face. It's about leaning in It's about, even getting the tables out of the way and, sort of squeezing into the center of the circle to have the conversation. It's just the circle is just a different way of doing things. And it lets people have their own ideas and make their own observations, use their own good eyes and ears to perceive, and then have a conversation. And so we've just found over and over again that that's a real tone setter for any kind of retreat or experience. When people realize that they really get a chance to talk to each other and think for themselves, you're in a different space when you get there, and it's quite good.
All right, perfect. Let's see. Next question's coming from MJ. Can you just talk about the descriptions on the back of the cards on the bottom half of the screen?
So I'm looking at the screen. I see the Visual Explorer kit, and if we're looking at the picture here, there's some cards that have text on them. So those are the instruction cards. So each of these decks actually comes with some cards that are just instructions. It's like those games you used to play when you were little, or maybe you still play them now. You'd open up the deck and there'd be a few cards that would just have instructions. And so we do that. And so we also have a user's guide. We have the materials online at those links that I posted. But right there in the deck are some tips to get started right away. So that's why those are there. And obviously you take those out before you hand them to participants.
And then, of course, the more detailed guides are in the guide that comes with the kit. And you can buy these. You can buy the guides actually separately. I mean, in theory, for example, you could create your own leadership metaphor deck, but actually buy the guide separately for how you would use it. So they are available. The guides come with the kit, but they're also available separately.
All right, perfect. Next question coming from Dave. For someone new to this kind of tool, what one piece of advice would you offer that would help make a session using this successful?
One piece of advice. So
you can have one piece, and I'll have one pice, Chuck.
Okay, let me have my piece of advice. My piece is don't over-explain. Don't over-instruct. So I did that little riff on what metaphors are. And a lot of times people think that they have to do something like that. They have to explain the theory behind the tool, and it's not really necessary. It's not necessary for you to have a whole bunch of slides to introduce an experience like this. In fact, I've almost cut the cord completely in terms of not using PowerPoint when I do facilitations like this. The whole point is getting into a mode of paying attention, being observant and reflective, and talking to one another, and then building on the dialogue. So not over-instructing people, not having too many PowerPoints, and putting people right away into dialogue, and then keeping them in dialogue. Some people think that, oh, well, a dialogue, we can have a dialogue in 20 minutes, right? And like, well, if it's really successful, it's going to, it might go an hour, because when a dialogue is really good, people really don't want to stop. They want to keep engaged. So we had a good colleague who was working with a bunch of techies in the telecom industry, and these were people that mostly weren't very verbal in how they participated in meetings, let's say. And so he thought, well, I'll use Visual Explorer to just kind of loosen up the conversation. We have all day together to talk about our team. And so he used Visual Explorer, and that same dialogue lasted for several hours, because it really just opened people up to dialogue. And so getting to that open dialogue and staying there is the point. It's not just checking the box in the exercise.
Yeah, my piece of advice is kind of similar to Chuck's, and you don't have to be an experienced facilitator or to actually use tools like this. And it's the piece of advice I give is treat it like it's something that everybody does every day, and make it really matter of fact. And it might be, I'd like to try something just a little different so that we can actually have a good conversation about whatever the topic is, and to treat it as though it wasn't different. To treat it as though, don't we all do this every day? Isn't this just like a normal day at work? And to go in with that mode that it's, it's we're doing good work together in a different way, and it's be matter of fact about it. I think that's really important that people don't, and you don't give off vibes that it's unusual, due to make it feel that it's usual.
All right, great. Looks like this is our very last question, and this is coming from Marie. Can you talk a little more about the theory behind dependent, interdependent, and interdependent?
That's one for you, Chuck.
Okay. Yeah. How much time do we have? Yeah. Okay. So a couple things about this. It actually derives from a body of theory and practice, sometimes known as vertical development or integral development. And it says that people as individuals or as organizations, during the course of their existence, develop more integrated and more complex ways of thinking. Okay? So, the best analogy is a child growing up. A child learns how to speak, child learns how to walk, and goes through stages in these things. And so the child in high school is very different from the child in grade school. And what theorists and researchers and practitioners in this area, first one being Jean Piaget, discovered that this actually happens throughout the lifetime of an individual, and it also happens in organizations. So, and so this model is a model of organizations, and it just says that, if you look at history, okay, the human race, civilizations, right, started as being more dependent in nature. There was a person in authority, or the leader of the tribe, or the king or the queen, and that's the way work got done. There was somebody in charge. There was somebody at the top of something like a hierarchy. Maybe not all the way back in civilization, but for long periods. The Industrial Revolution helped make things more differentiated. And so organizations had a lot of functions, and so we got our modern functional organization, in which there's a lot of little moving parts, and each individual has to act somewhat independently to get that moving part taken care of. And it's actually better if they're somewhat independent, because then the work process can be defined for that independent part. And that works really well in many ways. It's an advance in many ways on the dependent model. But then it too breaks down, and that's what happens to these different modes. Is they work well, but then they break down. And so what we're experiencing, I think, in the world today is that we've reached the limit of this, entrepreneurial, independent, heroic mode of leadership, and organizations of all kinds are exploring much more interdependent ways of working, which are more agile, more fluid, less defined as individual parts, and more defined by work roles and outcomes. The holacracy is an example of an interdependent form of organization. It's interesting, though, when we look at back to the literature for the terms dependent, independent, interdependent. This model has actually been used for a long, long time. We sort of trace all the way back to the 60s as kind of it's just been kind of a shorthand for the way things are, and it turns out that the theory and research holds up. So we like it because it's a simple model. We're actually moving now, in addition to the kind of three-stage model, Bill Torbert, one of our mentors, talks about actually 7 transformations along the way. So beneath the 3, there's actually 7. And so stay tuned on that. We're writing about that now. Look up William Torbert if you're more interested in his 7 transformations of leadership that are kind of underneath this 3-stage model.
All right, great. Those are some awesome questions. If we actually, I'm going to scroll up through that chat box, and if I saw that, we missed some questions, we'll actually be sending those over to David and Chuck, and then they'll be answering them, and then we'll actually send those out in an email about mid-next week. So David and Chuck, would you just like to add any final thoughts before I wrap up?
Yeah, thank you so much for spending an hour with us here, folks. And this is work we're passionate about, and we love to do it. We love to be working with Sarah on an HRDQ. So any further insights, and I asked Sarah to make certain that you got our email addresses if you want to have a conversation with you. There's one of the things that comes with our work. If you get involved in this stuff and you want to talk to us, there's a great after-sales service. We will tend to respond and help you set up and use these tools. I just wanted to make a very quick response to MB, and that is that they are different kits, and the Leadership Metaphor Explorer is basically much more prescribed metaphors, whereas a Visual Explorer, just so no words on it, and people kind of discover their own metaphors, has a wider application than just leadership. But thanks again, and over to you, Chuck.
Yes, ditto what David said. Thank you, Sarah, for hosting us. I do notice there's one question. Somebody was confused about the difference between Visual Explorer and Metaphor Explorer. Visual Explorer is just pictures, just photos. Sometimes they're photos of people doing things. In some cases, they're photos of classic artwork, but they're all photos without text. And the Metaphor Explorer are these drawings, unique drawings with labels. So, one's a set of drawings, one's a set of photos, and they work somewhat similarly, somewhat differently. The Visual Explorer is a much more general and versatile tool. We found out you can put any question into the middle of the Visual Explorer session, any question at all that people might have thoughts about. The Visual Explorer has just, a huge array of metaphors for thinking about whatever you want to think about. And so it might be if you're working on innovation, you're working on solving a problem, it's good for that. And so I just want to say thank you again.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much again, David and Chuck. And for everybody else on the line, we appreciate your time, and we hope you found today's webinar informative. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye now.